I'm Dr. Alvin Thomas. My work and this show is dedicated to educating, validating, elevating, and celebrating the importance of Black fatherhood. This is the Black Fatherhood Podcast. Welcome back to the Black Fatherhood Podcast. So today we'll talk a little bit about some issues related to the American working class. But first I want us to do a little bit of thinking. If you're like me, you may want to write it down, but let's engage in a little thought exercise. When I say the phrase American working class, what do you think of? Okay. Is the American working class white, black? So you would not be alone if you answered white. And according to a new book on the history of the black working class, you would also be wrong. As our next guest argues, this national myth leaves little room for black workers or to glean any lesson from their histories. Today, we're talking about the origins of the black working class and the people who comprise it then and now. Our guest is Dr. Blair Kelley. She's an award-winning author, historian, and scholar of the African American experience. A dedicated public historian, Kelley works to amplify the histories of black people, chronicling the everyday impact of their activism. Kelley is currently the Joel R. Williamson Distinguished Professor of Southern Studies at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, and the incoming director of the Center for the Study of the American South, the first black woman to serve in that role in the center's 30-year history. Her latest book is Black Folk, The Roots of the Black Working Class. Welcome, Blair Kelley.
Hi, thanks for having me.
So let's maybe start at the most basic level. Could you define for us what the black working class is and outline its origins?
So I think it's hard to define it very narrowly. And when I looked to write this history, it was a challenge to find a single definition. And most often, histories of the working class had focused on organizing, union sites, factory floors, those kinds of spaces. They had not talked about enslavement. They had not talked about the roots of where black people in America come from. They had not talked about sharecroppers or domestic workers or washerwomen for the most part. And so what I wanted to do was get a broader, more holistic, more human look at black workers and where their ethic came from. And so I start my inquiry in enslavement. I started with this longer, which I think a richer history of trying to figure out exactly where the working class come from.
And so we move from that starting point into and through emancipation. And you're right that W.E. Du Bois, following emancipation, W.E. Du Bois noted all the ways in which freedom had the ironic consequence of effectively de-skilling black workers. Can you explain a little bit about that?
So in enslavement, there were lots of enslaved people who had pretty specialized skills. Metal workers, masons, bricklayers, brick makers, iron workers, blacksmith. Those kinds of what historians have traditionally termed skilled professions. But in freedom, large numbers of black men who had those skills were not allowed to take those jobs. They were better paying jobs in freedom. They were considered more prestigious. And so lots of black men who had very complex skills, oftentimes from an African past. Many of the iron workers or masons, that was passed down from a West African traditions, were not allowed to have those jobs in freedom at all.
So it's amazing that during this enslavement period, the skills that had the ability to increase financial gain did so, and as soon as the individual became freed, they were stripped of the efficacy of those skills. That is amazing.
Yeah, so that they had, they were worth more as property, and yet not allowed to apply those trades as free people when it would have enabled them to make more.
I like that contrast, worth more as property. And the flip for that sounds like worth less as freed human beings.
Well, yeah, just blocked, prevented, not allowed to do those kinds of jobs. Absolutely.
So your book starts with or opens with the stories of Solicitor Duncan, John Dee, and Henry, a blacksmith. Tell us about those characters and why you start your book with their stories.
So Solicitor is my great-grandfather, who was a sharecropper in Elbert County, Georgia. And the story of him deciding to flee with his family from sharecropping and move to North Carolina is really an origin story for my family, a story that my grandfather told me a lot, a story that my own mother told me a lot. It was one I heard often. And so I start the book there because I think it's important to talk about the ways in which the positionality of the Black working class is not about their effort. It's not about their will. It's not about some deficiency in Black life, but rather a systemic problem that people had in freedom and not being allowed to get ahead and not being able to build themselves up. But that, from that, I don't want to argue that woe is me for that generation and that they had nothing. My argument here really is that they have a great deal. They're just not allowed to use what they have to make a living in the traditional sense. But they are using what they have to upbuild community, to interconnect with one another, to raise their children, to pass on a spirit of resistance and survival.
So tell us a story or a couple of stories from the book that speak to the rich history of Black fatherhood.
The story that makes me think most about fatherhood and labor and the stories of migration are the stories of my grandfather that I talk about in the book. Bruce Murphy was my father's father. He migrates from Accomack County, Virginia, on the Eastern Shore, and is really a person who's carrying the legacy forward of his family in terms of teaching my dad about farming. Accomack County was a region of the country where sweet potatoes and white potatoes were grown, really distributed all over the whole East Coast. Black people were largely prevented from benefiting from the riches that came from that market. But it didn't prevent my grandfather from taking great pride in thinking about those sweet potatoes. He would enter his sweet potatoes for prizes in county fairs and things like that. And so he would take my father from, the bed early on Saturday mornings. He had found a person who was also from Accomack County, who I don't think he knew when he was there. He met him in Philadelphia, and he had some land that he would let my grandfather farm for free. And so my grandfather would take my father early in the morning on the bus to Pennsauken, New Jersey, to farm sweet potatoes. And my dad was just annoyed by this whole thing, of course, having to wake up super early, earlier than school on the weekends to go do this work and labor and, work on the potatoes in the field. And then when the harvest would come and they'd have to pick the potatoes, he talked about his father's could see which roots would have the richest and fattest potatoes underneath, and by how the leaves looked. And, his knowledge of it was really quite grand. And then he'd bring those potatoes back to North Philadelphia on the bus, and then he'd give them all out. He'd give them out to Black people in the neighborhood for free. And my dad's always like, we could be selling these. We could make money. And he's like, you're missing the point, son. And so for him, it really was the tradition of his grandfather making sure that everybody had what they needed, of being collective, of teaching those skills that were passed down to him from his once enslaved ancestors and passing them down to my father. And so the care, the knowledge, the skill that he brought with him is part of that inheritance that I want to talk about in Black folk, that it isn't Black people who have no skills, who have no knowledge, who have nothing. There's a rich knowledge there, and there is something to pass down.
It's amazing that I also hear a little bit of the home folk being passed down there.
Yes. There's so much home folk. My grandfather found that man with the land. He also married my grandmother, who was also from the Eastern Shore. She was from the Eastern Shore of Maryland. Right. And so they might have met in one of those networks and connected. The woman that I write about, who is a domestic worker, Minnie Savage, she also meets her husband, who's also from the Eastern Shore, in Philadelphia. So there's clearly a whole network of home folks. I like to imagine that my grandfather may have known Minnie because of that connection, but I of course can't find that.
And of course, your father comes back with these potatoes, and it's not about selling them; it's about giving them to the community. So again, extending the network of home folk.
Yes, I mean, being of service and knowing that there were people in the neighborhood who needed more food, and that he could provide it. That being in city was harder and more expensive, and so he could provide support for those families too.
He was literally feeding the village.
Absolutely.
That whole idea of the village.
Absolutely.
Takes a village to raise a child. This was him giving to the village.
Just like his grandfather did when he would, fish the bay, he would bring back extra fish and just give them out. That sense of survival being more important and thriving being more important than making a profit was really central to what he thought of as his contributions as a man and as a father.
It feels like we don't see that as richly or as obviously as we used to see it before. I'm still trying to figure out if it's just an issue of us becoming very industrialized and very individualized, or if there might be other things, other factors at work as well.
I think, it was interesting because Bruce, first he had a victory garden in Philadelphia during the war. And then that got paved over and turned into housing. And, he couldn't garden in the city anymore. And so he had to go to a great deal of effort to find somebody who had land. And Pennsauken is a strong bus ride away. It's probably a 45-minute bus ride at the time. And so, he's putting an effort to be connected to land. But so for most people in his neighborhood, they had no connection to the land anymore. They had no ability to get back to touch that ground. Even though there's little microcosms of it, they would have chickens in the alleyways. And there's a big story about a chicken in my family, too, that gets cooked up, after a while. And all the children are crying and my dad's eating the chicken. But they wanted those connections, and that's where they were from. Their children don't have as strong of those connections, right? Because they get dislocated over time and become, more creatures of the urban space and less so creatures of these very rural spaces that they are from. But, in my grandparents' generation, there's always that craving for land. And, my maternal grandparents move out of Philadelphia and to a rural place in South Jersey so that they can replicate that on their own land, finally. So that the drive and that desire to pass those things down really does require certain things, and urbanity dislocates some of that.
Thank you so much. I like how you talk about the starting with Solicitor Duncan's story and others is a way for you to trace back your own family's origin story, to trace back to blood. But then you also talk about how much of this book is rooted in stories of people, many of whom were part of community. So they weren't related by blood, but they're still considered home folks, members of a community of family beyond blood ties that still held meaning after freedom. Tell us about these home folks. What exactly is this home folks?
So one of the figures that I talk about is a woman named Sarah Hill. And I talk about her work as a washerwoman. And I discovered after finding her interview that her family was in bondage in Elbert County, where my own ancestors, including Henry, who you mentioned earlier, the farthest back ancestor I can find on my mother's side, was held in bondage in Elbert County. And so I mentioned that my grandfather probably would have thought of her as home folks. And the sort of joy that people could find in that connection back to where they were originally from, I think goes beyond, as you said, blood and ties and exactly whose mother is who and whose aunt and this traceable ancestry, but rather the sense that the enslaved built community, whether or not there was blood, because there were so many who were left behind or separated or pulled apart in that process. And so there's a constant remaking of kinship and family that happens in enslavement that continues in freedom and becomes a network and a powerful way in which people can connect to one another. And so we see that in migrations that there are those desires to reconnect with this broader sense of what kin might be. We used to call it fictive kin, but there's really nothing fictive about it if there is that sense of responsibility and connection based on the place that you were from.
So I hear in that a little bit of kicking against the nomenclature of fictive kin.
Yeah.
Tell us a little bit about why you're going against that, although that's a much debated topic in academia. Why are you pushing towards something apart from fictive kin?
I picked a Richard Wright quote for the beginnings of the book, and in part, he says that there's such joy in finding a relative, even if it's like your eighth or ninth cousin, like where you really wouldn't even know exactly what the tie was, but that there is this pride and this joy in it, and the ability of people to survive the unsurvivable. Both in slavery and in freedom and through the migrations, all these twists and turns that are so challenging really is buoyed by that sense of that broad sense of family, of kinship. And so, fictive kin is the scholarly term for the idea that, you can't necessarily trace a blood relationship. But I think it's a misnomer a bit, because it does miss the richness of those connections and how, your child might be raised by someone that you're calling an aunt, and that person may not be an aunt, but they become an aunt because they are family and they are helping you maintain your family.
So as a former English literature teacher in high school, I'm always intrigued by language choice and your concern around fictive kin versus home folk. But I also heard you multiple times being very careful about the language that you're using to describe what people might think of as the ancestors. So you talk about them as being held in bondage versus being enslaved. You talk about, you refer to them as the enslaved rather than as slaves. Talk to us a little bit about that.
I think I'm very much convinced by scholars of the history of slavery who have reminded us that the humanness of people should be first, that everything that you are is not a slave if you are held in bondage by someone else, that you are also a mother, a father, you are also a person with dreams and visions, you are also an artist or a singer or any number of different kinds of things. And so to reduce someone to the status of this terrible system and not consider the broader human condition that they are held in slavery, that they are held in bondage. If I, someone takes me hostage tomorrow and holds me hostage, I don't become a hostage. I am still who I am. I still am Blair and this broader person with broad interests and skills beyond my status in bondage. And so I think that's what I'm trying to speak to in those spaces.
It feels like you just took us to church on that one, and I really appreciate it. Speaking of church, the church is really central to the Black experience in America, and your book talks about how the church influenced and supported the Black working class. In fact, you wrote that churches would be the spaces that nurtured the political vision Black people had for themselves. Small church houses became a training ground to prepare for the next fight. Churches drew less attention than political organizations did, but they could serve similar purposes. You also wrote that African American churches provided not only sanctuaries for the expression of faith, but a launching pad for the working class and working class organizations. Tell us a little bit more about that.
So for me, looking at churches is to look at the first Black institutions. And the founding of churches goes back into enslavement in the sense of a separate and unique cosmology and a unique sense of self that isn't defined by the people who are holding them in bondage, begins in slavery in those spaces. It's connected to an African past. So much of the traces of what we can see in Black Christianity are connected to faithways that are easier to pass down than language. Language, we know, is systematically blocked and destroyed in the process of enslavement. But that certain practices are holy and imbued with power, is maintained over time. And we can see the traces of those practices. And so it lets us know that this is a unique institution that isn't just the mirror copy of white Christianity and white churches. And so the power that begins in those spaces is an independent sense of self, that sense of community and family and connection in the family of Christ, and a rereading of Black Christianity. And so they can discern the lie that is at home in slavery and in the white Christianity that their slave masters want to pass down to them. Slaves, obey your masters. And instead, they see the story of a people who are held in bondage and who God wants to be free. And they can see themselves. And so I think it is the very first space in which they are imagining a liberatory possibility collectively. And so as free people, they turn those secret churches, those spaces in the woods, into real institutions. And then in those institutions, they can foster literacy, they can foster political activism, they can feed one another, they can care for one another, they can mourn with those who mourn, they can bury their dead, they can celebrate marriages and births, and they have a bigger sense of what is possible politically and economically. They can talk about good jobs and bad jobs and connections, and they make those connections with one another in those spaces. So those churches are whole communities, whole laboratories for the upraising of a community. And so often we wonder, how did the enslaved end up with communities and homes and neighborhoods so quickly? It's because they already had institutions and they use those institutions as launching pads. And so to skip over that, if you're studying Black labor, is to skip over really, that groundwork that is so powerful.
Thank you so much. That was really rich, a really rich compacting of history. Thank you so much for that. So we don't have enough time to get into all of the really incredible stories that you share about regarding the early days of the Black working class and how laundresses, Pullman porters, domestic maids, and postal workers kind of helped to shape the American working class. But if you can, briefly speak to us about those groups and why they were so important.
I picked the professions that really stood out for me in terms of their independence and in terms of their ability to upbuild unions and organize in ways that are really powerful. We don't think much about washerwomen today, in part because they don't exist. We all have washers in our laundry rooms, or we go to laundromats and struggle by ourselves to do our laundry. But prior to the advent of that machinery, laundry was largely done by Black women, and independently so in their own homes. And the process by which that they organize is a powerful and interesting reminder of the vision that the enslaved moved into freedom with, that they understood the world and they were smart about the world. The Pullman Porters I highlight in part because they're the largest Black private union in the United States. In their time period, Pullman is the largest employer of Black men, and they use that desire that George Mortimer Pullman had to evoke enslavement and the romantic version of the plantation on his train cars to become a monopoly on the job and use that power to enrich and broaden what was possible for Black workers as a whole. So I don't think you can tell the story of the Black working class and the roots of the Black working class without talking about the Pullman Porters. Postal workers are, such a powerful force today that we take for granted as being a very Black space. And yet there is a history of struggle there, and a history that I think most Americans do not know about in terms of Black workers having to fight for access to the only working class job ensured by the U.S. Constitution. So those were why I picked those professions and those discussions. I think together they give you a vision of where exactly what those roots are.
So sticking with the Pullman Porters, the postal workers, and some of those more union adjacent organizations, you wrote that members of the Black working class are more likely to be union members today than any other racial group. Do you see some of that coming out of that history? Why is that, and what is the connection between Black Americans and unions?
Absolutely. I would think it is at root because of this longer history that we don't always know about. The Pullman Porters were such an effective and important organizing tool in building civil rights in this country. And so the connections that people had to that union go beyond the individual workers and the needs of those workers. So often we think of unions as just getting good things for the people who are in those kinds of employment. But the Pullman Porters made union work civil rights work. And they were key in dismantling much of the segregation in federal employment. A. Philip Randolph helped to organize the march that we know most famously in American history, the March on Washington in 1963. That movement started in the 1930s under the Pullman Porters. And so the idea of a union within Black community has not fallen victim to the propaganda that I think many American workers have about the effectiveness of unions in terms of like you just pay dues and they don't do anything for you. That's so clearly a lie in Black history, and so that habit and that sense of like a union can create possibilities is such an important one within our communities, and that so many people are postal workers, and most of those postal workers are union members as well. It really also forms this continuing base. And so when I ran into that statistic, I was surprised, but I wasn't, when I thought about it and I sat with it, it made sense. But it's a story of resistance. It's a story of perseverance because so many Black people are Southerners in a place where the South is extremely hostile to union organizing. And so that persistence is really remarkable in and of itself.
Thank you so much. So I'm going to pull two major issues that you talk about. One of which is that you've talked about the post office and the surprisingly large role that the post office has played in Black America, so much so that you've written specifically that the post office is a reminder that the Black working class is a bellwether of the health of a democratic citizenship in America, and that any gains left unprotected are fragile, though more than worthy of the fight. Then you also talk about legislation. You talk about legislation, how legislation matters, and that there were some pivotal legislative actions that shaped the Black working class. Tell us how the New Deal and the efforts of Southern legislators to counter labor protections for Black Americans shaped the working class, and how the idea of the gains left unprotected are fragile, how that fits into that.
So initially, when the first labor protections that we know of, when Social Security is being upheld, disability, all those things in the New Deal that helped to put America back together are being constructed in this time period. Domestic workers, household workers were left out of it, as well as agricultural workers. And so at that time, the overwhelming majority of Black Americans who were at work were employed in those areas. And so to systematically exclude them with the notion that, the hours weren't clear, and so you couldn't give them hourly protection, and you couldn't do this and you couldn't do that. It was a private matter and between private parties, really was a thin excuse for the systematic attack on Black labor at that time period. And so I wrote about the post office, during this previous election, there was such erosion of the post office under Louis DeJoy, and the sense that, the post office is slow and inefficient and not important. And, there's this new campaign that's been waged on the post office over the past few decades to make it seem as though it is not important. But the pandemic and these elections have reminded us that the post office is essential to the functioning of our democracy in really fundamental ways, and important for the most fragile folks in society. Not everybody is even on a UPS route or a FedEx route, and they need their mails. And so protection of the post office is for the protection of our democracy. Absolutely.
Yep. I totally agree with you. In 1941, President Roosevelt signed an Executive Order 8802. What was that order, and why is it so foundational to the Black working class in America?
That really was I'm pretty sure, the desegregation of federal employment. And, that was fought for by the Pullman porters, and the degree to which he was really pushing for access. He's pushing for greater jobs. And as I said, the sense that Black workers were central to that union, not just Pullman porters themselves, but the conditions for all Black workers were so essential.
So I'm thinking now, we've done all of this history, all of this really rich history going beyond 1941 and before. And our listeners are probably wondering, well, what does that have to do with me today? Like, so what? Okay, great, we have the history, you could read it. What does work look like for the Black working class going forward? What's the prospects for us?
I think, I was excited about the possibility of writing this history, because for me, history is central to everything. During the pandemic, we had this term essential worker that got bandied about. And we know that Black people, people of color, were overrepresented among those considered essential, and yet not adequately rewarded for the risks that they took on so that the rest of us could shelter in place and be at home. And so if we are forgetting about where this Black working class comes from, the particular kind of consciousness that they built, the broad sense of what was possible when working in collectivity and in community and thinking beyond the individual, the things that make Black workers unique in American history are things that would benefit all workers and lift all of us in ways that are important and powerful. When we need people to take on jobs that provide a standard of living and comfort for all of us. And so to respect work, to honor work, to see it as essential to who we are as a nation is how Black people have moved in this history, and how we need to think about workers today.
Thank you so much for agreeing to talk with us. This was a very rich conversation on the history of the Black working class, history of Black labor, and it gives us something to think about with regard to where Black labor goes beyond this, beyond the enslavement, beyond the Jim Crow era, beyond the current era, and what that would look like the next 10, 20, 30, 40 years. So thank you very much for kind of laying out this really beautiful landscape for us. Thank you so much.
Absolutely. My pleasure.
Thanks, Blair Kelley, for joining us today to discuss the history of the Black working class and for giving us a more humane look at Black workers from enslavement to present, celebrating and chronicling their contributions to American society. Dr. Kelley reminds us of the insidiousness of policies and institutions in their dealings with Black people. They were worth more as property. The skills that were highly prized as enslaved human property suddenly were devalued and beyond their reach once these individuals were freed from enslavement. Black folk struggled, organized, and resisted throughout, and today the struggle looks different, but the legacies of resistance remain, and the devaluation looks different. Kelley shares intimate stories of her father and grandfather working a potato farm and distributing the produce to Black families in the neighborhood, modeling and passing down skills of caring for community connection to home folk, of inheritance of hard work and sacrifice. Black folk, the roots of the Black working class, is Blair Kelley's beautiful contribution of service to the community, providing history and roots from which communities can find meaning, purpose, and future. You've been listening to the Black Fatherhood Podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Alvin Thomas. I'm a clinical psychologist, researcher, and the director of the TriLab at the University of Wisconsin-Madison's School of Human Ecology. Original music for our series was composed and performed by Micaiah De Silva. Our series producer is Joe Ruby. The podcast is supported by the School of Human Ecology at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. And you can follow me on Twitter at Dr_AT758. That's Dr_AT758. And on the web at thomaslab.humanecology.wisc.edu. Make sure to subscribe to the Black Fatherhood Podcast wherever you listen to your podcasts.